Hi, Faith here. We're going to talk about thinking ahead. We're in mid-May, but it's not too early to start considering what's to come. And in the world that we live in right now, some things that are pretty guaranteed that are coming are dry months. We need to think about our water needs for the garden and our farms. So right here, we have two raised beds, and in front of you another raised bed. You'll see that this one is heavily mulched, waiting to be planted. This one was heavily mulched, but we exposed it so that I could do some demonstration here. We just installed a really simple drip irrigation system for this bed. Having drip in place prior to planting is wonderful. It gives you a pattern to plant by. I know that I have 3 drip tape lines or rows in this bed, so I could either go for some larger plantings right in between each drip tape, so I could have 2 rows of plantings here, or I could do some smaller things like lettuces or basils or some fast growing cabbages, or I might even be able to get some tat soy or bok choy going. It's a little late for some of those guys, but you could do some smaller plantings, things that aren't going to take up a whole lot of circumference on the bed, and their root systems would do well to be close to the water source. Certain vegetables like your celery and your lettuces, they're very water dependent vegetables for their growth. They really need a lot of water in order to become that harvestable vegetable. So best to keep those close to the drip tape. Vegetables, fruits like peppers and even tomatoes, they can have really expansive root systems. So you don't necessarily have to have them right next to that drip tape. You could go right in the middle. They're large plants. They're going to have a big circumference, big area. They're going to take up a lot of space above and below ground if you've got soil that will allow it. So they could be planted in the center. You'll have to do some spot watering while they're getting established, and then your drip tape should be able to take over from there. But thinking ahead about our water needs. Rainwater is the best source of water for your plants. That's how they have evolved to acquire their water. It's from the sky. And so ideally, you are going to capture every drop of water that hits your land with a soil that can allow it to infiltrate. Well-structured soil is not easily came by if it's been manipulated or utilized for gardening or farming for a long time, because we break that structure up whenever we manipulate the soil. If you have a compaction zone, say you've been tilling your garden for a long time, just below the tillage equipment, more than likely you've got a compaction zone that can be very shallow in its depth, or it could be very deep. It really depends. Making an assessment of where your compaction zone is underneath the topsoil layer is a good idea, so you know how deep your root systems are going to be able to go and how deep the water will go when it does infiltrate. There are some really great DIY soil health tests you can do, like a water infiltration test, like a root penetration test, and also a water stable aggregate test. We'll do some of those videos in the future so that you can understand how you can make a good soil health assessment all on your own. But in the meantime, consider, as you're going into the growing season, what your water needs are going to be. They're going to be high. And so have a good water source, if you can, accessible to you. Sorry about that. We have a little bit of fair preparation going on. We're here at our local fairground, and they're getting ready for the fair. This community garden is a giving garden that the master gardeners have utilized for several years, and I'm operating as a giving garden for the last 2 seasons. Little context. So in this bed, we've got our drip irrigation system, so we're going to be conserving our water. We're going to not apply it willy-nilly. We're going to make sure it's going to the root zone of the plants. I'm not opposed to overhead watering, certainly in the evening when we've got low propensity for evaporation. Wonderful time to do that overhead watering, and a lot of plants do well with overhead watering. If you can utilize rainwater, if you have rainwater catchment, by all means, please utilize that. That is a very good, clean water source in most instances. much of our agricultural land in our Midwest region has impacted our water sources, and so our water has a lot of dissolved solids in it, a lot of nutrients in it. Some good for plants, some not so good for plants, but in many cases, just a lot, an excess of nutrients, which can hike our pHs way up, which can cause nutrient tie-up in our soils. So if you're using municipal water, know that it can work against you when it comes down to getting nutrients into your plant. We'll talk about how to get around that in another module. We've got our irrigation system in place. We're going to be conserving our water when we do apply it. We are using gracefully, a municipal water source that's being supplied to this garden. Wonderful. Absolutely going to make sure we're being conservative with that. But having that drip tape oriented, the emitters oriented towards the soil, that's going to, of course, orient that water right into the root zone. If you mulch over this T-tape, you are going to preserve that water at the soil surface. That will help prevent the water from evaporating on the really hot, dry days in between those rains. So you want to make sure you're utilizing, I like to use a plant-based mulch. I really love straw. Organic straw or organic hay would be my preference. Straw is nice because it's really high in carbon. I don't choose to use wood chips on a vegetable bed just because it is such a high carbon source and so little nitrogen is coming in with that wood chip that in order for it to be broken down, which is just the natural way, a moist plant-based mulch will be broken down by those decomposer organisms, whether they are the earthworms, the roly-polies, the microarthropods of different types, those springtails. They're going to start that breakdown process, the decomposition of the mulch. And if it's wood chips, having very little nitrogen, once it gets into a smaller particulate size and the bacteria that are actually on the wood chip itself, they're going to need nitrogen in order to break that down. The carbon to nitrogen ratio of bacteria can be anywhere from 3:1 to 8:1. So you want to make sure that if you're applying a mulch to your soil surface, that it is a mulch that's not going to take away nitrogen from your plants. Straw is a high carbon substrate. It is a high carbon plant-based material. Hay has more nitrogen. It's got a more narrow carbon to nitrogen ratio. The straw has a little bit wider carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's because it was cut while standing dead, dry, and so all of the nitrogen had either volatilized or been any other nutrients had been sent back down to the soil before being cut. But with hay, it's cut while green, and so that nitrogen that was contained in those chlorophyll molecules, that of which it was maintained, some of it's going to gas off, some of it's going to volatilize, but some of it's going to be maintained in that hay, and so it will actually be a nutritive input to your garden. Either way, whichever one you choose, plant-based mulch I really like because it feeds the trophic levels of the soil. You're actually feeding some of the community members in the soil, and the plants love it too. Preserves moisture. So we're thinking about our water retention, watering at night, past peak sun, somewhere, past 7 o'clock is a great time if you can do it. If you have a large space, you might have to start a little earlier. You can also water in the morning, depending on what you're watering. If you've had a lot of humidity, look at your tomato plants, look at your cucumbers, look at the ones that are more susceptible to leaf-borne fungal diseases. Perhaps maybe you want to water them going into the day so that the sun is going to actually dry off the leaf surface. But if you are orienting your water more towards the soil surface, water at night. And that way it doesn't evaporate. You don't lose it. Just going to take a look at my notes here. So we've got the water going, keeping the soil moist. It doesn't have to stay consistently moist. It doesn't have to be, super hydrated all the time, but you can see right there, that soil is relatively moist. If you squeeze it, it makes a ball. If you poke it, it falls apart. It's a good little test for seeing if your soil is moist enough. That's right at moist enough. You've got enough moisture in there for it to kind of stick together like a ball. You know, there's a little bit of clay, the humic substance and humic substances in the soil will also kind of be clay-like. So that's a good moisture level. It could be a little more moist. It could be a little more dry. But right here at the soil surface, you can see that it's very dry. When the soil gets this dry, it's oxidized because it's been exposed to oxygen in the atmosphere. 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen. It's also been exposed to UV. And that breaks down those carbon molecules, those bridges that pull together the organic matter, the soil organic matter that pull together the sand, silt, clay particles in your soil. That breaks down when the soil oxidizes and is damaged by UV, and that is more prone to happen with soil that is really dry. When your soil dries out, your biological life, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, the amoebae, they are going to either go dormant if they have the capacity to do so, or they're going to die. And so that's why you don't want to let your soil dry out completely. You can go through cycles. You know, that is the way of things in nature. You have cycles. The soil is never consistently moist at the same moisture level all the time. So a little bit of up and down is fine, but you want to keep it hydrated enough, moist enough to where your biological life doesn't have long periods of being dormant. The biology is what is cycling the nutrients in the soil and feeding those to your plant, whether it is through supplying it into the soil solution or through a really wonderful process called rhizophagy. Please look that up. Look up Dr. James White. You'll learn about rhizophagy. But plants are dependent on the microbes in order to acquire their nutrients. If they don't get their nutrients from the soil microbes, then you are dependent. You are their ward. You have to provide for them if you allow your soil's microbes to go dormant. So don't do that. Keep your soil moist. You can allow some ups and downs, but use a mulch. A plant-based mulch is wonderful. Early in the season, in early April, if you have slugs in your area, by all means, don't hyper mulch your soil. Just go for a thin layer of mulch where you can just barely see the soil. But that will do a little bit to keep the moisture in. By the time we get to June and July, get a thick layer of mulch. I'm talking like 3 and 4 inches of mulch in order to make sure that that soil doesn't have an opportunity to release that water to the atmosphere. We have those hot, dry summer days. You want to make sure that you are keeping that water in place. Keeping your soil planted with living, growing green plants. This is not an example of that. But living, green, actively growing plants is critical for feeding the biological life. They are after those root exudates, those photosynthates, those sugars that the plants create. They need that carbon themselves in order to survive, and they are focused all around the rhizosphere, all around that root zone, waiting for those carbon deliveries. And so keep a diversity of living, growing plants in your beds. And so by doing that, by keeping your soil moist, by keeping the biological life fed and active, you're going to have a better chance of staving off pest and disease issues and nutrient deficiencies, which will result in pest and disease issues. And so keeping the nutrient cycle going in your soil so that your plants don't go through these really hungry gaps where there's nobody there to feed them, the biology is dormant, and they are relying on that biology to feed them, and so therefore they're going through a deficiency phase. That's when they become really susceptible to pest and disease. We'll talk about other ways to prevent that in just a moment. Another thing that you can think about during the growing season, once your plants are fully developed, they've got their structure kind completed, they're going into their reproductive phase. Say you have tomatoes here. Say you have 2 rows of tomatoes, maybe I'll have 8 tomatoes in this bed. My tomatoes are going to be at a minimum this tall. If you prune them, they could stay that way. They could go much taller if they're an indeterminate variety. So that tomato is now in its reproductive phase. It's putting on, you know, several pounds of fruit per plant, and it's tapping the supply of nutrients that are being cycled in the soil. Any of the nutrients that are in the soil solution, it is taking those up pretty rapidly because it is maturing many fruit at once. One of those nutrients that will become really short in supply is potassium during that fruit expansion phase, during that cell elongation phase. We talked about calcium being that vegetative element that is really important during that vegetative phase, the structuring phase. The potassium is really important during the reproductive phase and the swelling of the fruit, getting sugars into the fruit. And so that potassium supply can get tapped out during that period, especially if you have more than one tomato in a particular bed and if you have a dry month. You know, if your water, you know, if the rain, the sky's faucet turns off in July, right when you're starting to expand fruit, then your potassium source is cut off. Potassium is only available in solution. It's available with the flow of water in the soil, and it doesn't, you know, get bound up in microbes so much. It doesn't get bound up in organic molecules. It's primarily available through the flow of water, so through mass uptake. And so in order to have adequate potassium through the fruit fill phase, you may need to do a little bit of supplementation. We'll talk about that when we are looking at a foliar feed, but you're also going to need to make sure your soil stays really well hydrated. Another way that you can assist those maturing tomato plants, those tomato plants that are maturing their fruit, is to get some younger, more juvenile plants into the system. And so once a plant goes into its reproductive phase, it shuts off the tap to the soil. It actually has a reorientation of its photosynthetic energy. Those photosynthates are oriented towards the fruit at that point and not so much towards the soil. So they're not feeding the soil microbes during their fruit ripening phase. You might find that it would be really helpful to have some younger plants in this scenario that you just kind of pop in after you've started going into that reproductive phase that are going to start feeding those microbes again in good quantity. Younger plants, especially annuals, when they're in their vegetative phase, invest a lot of their photosynthetic energy into the soil. They feed the microbes, they build the relationships early in their life that they're going to depend on later in their life. And so when you have tomato plants, especially if you have more than 4 or so in a small area, that's a lot of pull from the soil microbes. So the law of return is that you would give back. You would make sure that somebody's getting some photosynthate back into the soil, and that's going to benefit those tomato plants. So you could come in, once your tomato plants are of good size, you could replace those basil plants if they were looking a little aged, if they were starting to go into their reproductive phase. You could bring in some head lettuce that maybe you have in seed trays ready to go in that are still, seedlings, small. You could come in directly just with some seed. You could bring in, the basil seed. You can germinate basil pretty late into the summer and still get a little bit of a fall crop. You can germinate some carrots later in the season and still get a fall crop. Think about what you can sow in succession underneath your tomato plants that can handle that early shade and also germinate in a warm soil. There are a lot of seeds that will do that. You just got to think about your space consideration and the amount of sunlight that might be available. Think about successionally sowing something that you'll harvest later that will feed the soil and help support your tomato plants. Another thought is to come in with a diverse cover crop blend that you can just undersow. So you've got your mature tomato plants. You can do a little lower leaf pruning down here to open up some of that canopy for a germinating cover crop or another crop that you're going to harvest, and bring in a diverse cover crop blend and work that into the soil right under the canopy of your maturing tomato plants. And keep it hydrated, keep the soil hydrated. When you go to cover the mulch back over, you need good soil seed contact, and so you want to pull the mulch back when you're putting in a cover crop or if you're sowing a new seed. And then when you're bringing it back over, think about the size of the seed that you've just planted, whether it's cover crop or another crop. You don't want to block the light so much, or you don't want to create such a barrier for that seed when it's germinating to get above the mulch. Just smaller seed, very, very, very light mulch. A larger seed, you can go with a thicker mulch. It has enough vigor to get up and out of the soil and up and out of that mulch. But come in with a diverse cover crop blend underneath your tomato plants and get your fall cover crop started before you've said goodbye to your tomato plants. That's going to benefit your tomato plants. That's going to benefit all the microbes in the soil. It's going to benefit you in the spring next year because you're going to have cover that will have laid down over the winter. If you choose to use a winter kill cover crop, it'll lay down over the winter if you have a winter, if you do have hard freezes. And then if you're using a perennial, then God bless you, I am in your camp. Use a perennial cover. Just do a little research and find out what's best for you in your context. But think about bringing the cover crops in late August or mid-August, depending on where you are. If you're in California, bring it in a little bit earlier. If you just have to work with your temperatures, and you need to work with your moisture levels. So that's just thinking ahead so that you are prepared for what's coming. Think about successional planting, think about early cover cropping, think about keeping the moisture in the soil, capturing every drop of rainwater, and preserving your rainwater or your irrigation water by using your drip irrigation and your mulch.